Welcome back to mythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert, and today I am joined by the famous, depending on who you ask, infamous Dr. Bart D. Ehrman. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Do you like how I painted you, depending on who it is?
Well, it's very much true. It is. I was talking to friends today about the problem of academic freedom, and I was saying, man, if it weren't for academic freedom, I would have been fired 30 years ago.
Bart, I always enjoy our conversations. You have a way about how you express when you teach, and it's enjoyable. You have a course that you're actually working on now that really piques my interest. As you know, I'm a weirdo. I like to get down into the weeds. Some of our conversations in the past show that. What is this one about? Something to do with the corruption, Scribal? Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, this one isn't just for weirdos. This one, for a long time, scholars have recognized, and now I think over the last 20 years, lay people have recognized that we don't have the original writings of the New Testament. When somebody like, Mark wrote his gospel, he wrote something on probably with, a pen on papyrus, and we don't have that thing. And we don't have the copy that was first made of that or the copy of the copy. The copies we have of Mark are from much, much later. Our first complete copy is 300 years later. This course, it'll be a 4-lecture course that deals with how Mark and the other books of the New Testament were altered by copyists as they were copying them, altered in many cases prior to our having any copies. And so the question is, how do we know what the authors of the New Testament originally wrote? The course will be called the Scribal Corruption of Scripture.
And there's so many questions that come from this. So I don't want to give away too much of the main course. Maybe we can give people some popcorn or a little appetizer here, teasing them as to why this course will be fun and what you'll be covering. Can you tell us some things that you think this course will hopefully answer for people and give us a little tease?
Yeah, so a long time ago, in 2005, I published a book called Misquoting Jesus, which is also, the title of the podcast I do. And it was by far the best-selling book I've ever done, and is a book that none of my academic friends thought anybody would want to buy, because it was about scribes copying the New Testament in Greek. I mean, who wants to read about that? But once people realized how interesting this is, they said, "Whoa!" And so because people who are firmly committed to the Bible assume that when you're reading a verse, you're just reading what the author wrote. But what if it's the case, as it is, that there are lots of differences in lots of our manuscripts? I mean, we're not talking about like a dozen differences here and there. Within our surviving manuscripts, there are hundreds of thousands of differences. And so how do you deal with this? And how do you know what the author originally wrote? And how do you know how a scribe changed it? And why would a scribe change it? And, they didn't change the Quran. They didn't change the Torah. Why are they changing the New Testament? And so these are all questions I dealt with in my book. And so this course will be related to that. It's not going to just be my book. I mean, I'm not just going to repeat everything that in my book. In fact, I'm going to be talking about all sorts of examples that I've never talked about before and deal with all sorts of issues. Responses to this book by evangelicals. There were probably 4 or 5 books written against that book. And so I'll be talking about, what others have said about it and try to show why this is a problem area for New Testament scholarship.
Now people can understand why I said infamous, famous Bart.
The thing is, the things I say are said by biblical scholars everywhere. It's just they don't tell anybody except for themselves. And so I'll repeat lines that my mentor, Bruce Metzger, who is a very, very famous textual scholar that evangelicals love, I'll repeat precisely the lines that he said, and they get all over me for it. But they loved it when he said it. Same thing.
It is very interesting. That's a whole nother question of what is, going on there. But I'm looking forward to it because I imagine that there are textual variants or scribal changes that sometimes are going to be, and I imagine we'll see this in the course, extremely impactful doctrinally. I'm not saying that most of them are. You've said in your book before, maybe you can elaborate on that to tease people, but I imagine some of them are pretty significant.
Yeah. I mean, and, I talk about the hugely significant ones in my book, because I couldn't very well write a book about the scribes changing the text, not mention the ones that are real doozies, but there are a lot that are really important that I don't mention. But, the doctrine of the Trinity is found in only one verse of the New Testament. The explicit statement that you have the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and that the three beings are divine, but the three are one. That doctrine. So not just mentioning that there is a Father, or there is a Spirit, or there is a Son, but that the three are one. That's the doctrine of the Trinity.
Right.
It's found in only one verse, and it's in a verse that is found in the King James Bible, but it's not in most modern translations, except for fundamentalist translations will have it in it. And it definitely, absolutely was not there originally. So, who added it? When did they add it? Well, we know why they added it. They wanted the biblical record to give the doctrine of the Trinity. And so that makes sense. So you have things like that. Now, I'm not saying by that, if that verse were gone, then Christians would no longer believe in the Trinity. Of course they would. Christians are going to believe whatever they want to believe, and they're not going to be dependent on a single verse. But it's the reality. Without that verse, it's not explicitly stated in the New Testament.
This makes me wonder if some of what you're describing here has overlap with what happened with Marcion. And I know there are several people who have different opinions in academia about the order in which things happened. Did he dumb down and tweak a version of Luke, or the back and forth when it comes to this? But as far as scribal changes, that would be a major example of extreme changes to an earlier text. If Marcion, let's say, redacted a version of Luke or something to make his own version.
Right. Yeah.
Do you see that? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue.
Right.
It took me about 20 minutes to explain it to my class today about Marcion. And so I'm not going to do that again right now. But, Marcion is the 2nd century church father who had one gospel in his New Testament. And it was a gospel that was like Luke. And it appears to have been different in many ways, including it probably didn't have what is now chapters 1 and 2. And he, according to the church fathers who opposed him, Tertullian and Epiphanius and others, Marcion had taken a copy of Luke and edited it in such a way as to make it more amenable to his own theology. And he may well have done that. Other scholars have argued that Marcion inherited a form of Luke that was radically different from our form of Luke. Other scholars, like me, think that both things are true. He probably had a form of Luke that was different in many ways from our Luke, but he also touched it up a bit, or took out bits that he didn't appreciate. And so it's very hard to say, because we don't have solid evidence for any of those views. But it's whichever view you have, it's quite clear that people were playing with the text of Luke, whether it was Marcion or somebody else, so that I think we don't have any manuscripts that lack chapters 1 and 2. Those are the chapters that tell the virgin birth story in Luke. We don't have any copies of Luke without those chapters, but I personally think that the first volume of Luke didn't have those chapters the first time it was published, that those chapters were added later. That wouldn't be a textual problem per se, because we don't have any texts without them, but it's related to a textual problem because it shows that people are changing these texts.
Now, this is in the weeds, but I just want your opinion, if you have a way of elaborating this without taking forever. Do you think, or do you see anything in our modern version of Luke, or let's just say post Tertullian and all these guys, responding to Marcion's heresy, or responding to something you think is a Marcion? I guess the way I put it is how you said both, you're allowing both ideas to be true at the same time. I wonder if the textual tradition is messy enough that what we've inherited finds little creep-ins by these scribes who are reacting to Marcion's theology in Luke.
So I have the first book I wrote for a broader scholarly audience, not for a general audience, but a scholarly audience, was called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And the entire thesis of the book was that 2nd and 3rd century Christian scribes copying the New Testament changed it in places in order to make the text less usable by heretics and more usable by Orthodox people opposing heretics. And so, as an example, Marcion did not think that Jesus was fully human. He thought that Jesus was a divine being and that he couldn't be human because, well, for a variety of reasons. So we won't go into it. But so he didn't think Jesus really had flesh and blood. And I show in this book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, what I'll be showing in this course, that there are passages in Luke that are intentional, look like they're intentionally changed. I think they have to be intentionally changed because there's no way these things happen by accident. There are places that were changed that do counter that understanding of Jesus as divine but not human. There are passages that elevate his humanity in a way to show that he really is a human being. And so, so, I mean, an example of that is there's a famous passage in Luke chapter 22 called it's the passage about the bloody sweat. This is where we get the idea that you're sweating blood from. It's where Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's sweating great drops as if of blood because he's in such deep agony. I argue, and I try to show in my book, that in fact, those two verses, which are missing from many of our best and oldest manuscripts, were not originally there, but they were added by scribes to counter the kinds of views of Christ that people like Marcion had.
This guy had a lot of blood in him. That's the point. Meaning he's very human.
Well, he's in deep agony, and God's not in any agony. So it's trying to show the very human side of Jesus.
That's so interesting because Luke also projects Jesus to almost be without fear at all facing death.
Yeah.
So there's this
that's the point. Luke does that. And the scribes wanted to kind of wamp it up a bit. They got to have a little humanity here. Come on. And so it takes a while to demonstrate that. In other words, you can't just kind of say it. You've got to show what the evidence is, what manuscripts have this, that, or the other thing, why these verses don't fit into the context of Luke, why the language in these verses isn't like Luke's language. I mean, scholars have to deal with all of this stuff. But in my course, I'll be showing how they go about doing it. How do scholars go about showing that something is a change rather than the original? And so that's going to be one of the really interesting parts of the course, is getting people to see what kind of logic and what kinds of evidence scholars use.
Dr. Ehrman, how many lectures will this one be?
This will be 4 lectures. It'll be all on one day. It'll be on November 11th. It's 1 day, 4 lectures. The lectures will be about 50 or 60 minutes each, and there'll be an extended Q&A afterward. And so it'll be it's going to be good. The thing is, you can go for a long time on just like a little bit of this. When we did this conference recently on new insights into the New Testament, I gave a 50-minute lecture on a change of one word in Mark's gospel. An entire 50 minutes, and there was no fat in there at all. I couldn't even cover the entire waterfront. So you can do a lot, but I'm not going to be going into that kind of detail here. But I am going to be talking about a lot of examples that most people would not have heard before, where sometimes even if you just change a single letter of a word, you completely change what a passage means.
I hope everybody signs up, check it out. I love that the world is coming across this education like way faster now. Yeah. We're actually getting, I call the scholars in the big universities, ivory tower academia. And we're finally coming down to earth where a lot more people are accessing this stuff. So you're playing a huge role in that, Dr. Ehrman. And I hope people will sign up now. Down in the description, I'll see you there. Any final words from you pertaining to this course?
Well, it's just what you're saying. I mean, this is the kind of knowledge that scholars have had for hundreds of years, and it's only recently that anybody else has recognized it. And so getting to know this kind of material better is important, not just for, it's not just for skeptics or not just for mythicists or not just for atheists and agnostics. It's for Christians too. I mean, this is important knowledge, and whatever a person's personal belief, the Bible is really important. And if you think the Bible is important, you need to know more about it. And this is a fundamental issue that involves the Bible. So I hope people of every persuasion comes to this course.
Same here. Thank you, Dr. Ehrman.